Ladies and gentlemen, today is June 30th, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it. This is right after the presidential debate in World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello?
Yo.
Hey. How are you?
Doing amazing. We basically finished the whole subathon. So a whole month of uptime. The stream has been online since June 1st.
Yeah, I noticed you only had 45 minutes left.
Yeah, but that goes up. It got down to under a minute.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Well, you sure you want to do this? I don't think it goes up that much when I'm on here.
Well, it survived last time. And someone said that they would enjoy watching you talk about paint drying earlier. So your reviews have been good. You've been getting consistently good reviews here. But if you get bad reviews, I'll let you know.
We've had a few.
Yeah.
I've had a few, more specifically, over time. I've been accused of being everything from a Bolshevik Stalinist to a American exceptionalist white supremacist.
Wow.
Yeah, I've got a lot of range, I guess.
That's intense. So, this week we have a very obvious ticket item. I didn't watch the whole discussion, but I guess my question is, what's the overall vibe of the world about the debate? Like, who's saying who won? How does it impact people's odds to win the election? Does it matter that much in the grand scheme of things? I guess that was a few questions.
I mean, the response has not been positive. I mean, there's an institutional response, and then there's like the public's response, right? So the public's response has been pretty universally negative. I think most casual viewers who are not that in tune with politics were not particularly taken with either candidate showing, although Biden in particular came in for scrutiny because, of course, rightly or wrongly, he's been targeted for his age. And so his big objective was just to not make the headlines by appearing very old. And mission failed. He did not nail that. You did not have to wait very long watching the debate to see him fail at that either. So, yeah, it was a bad night for Joe Biden overall. It's not cataclysmic. It's probably not going to decide the election or anything dramatic like that. There is a little rumor. There's some rumors going around that there's discussion behind the scenes of whether or not he can really go the distance on this. But most likely they're kind of stuck with him whether they think he can go the distance or not. So I don't think it really matters if they want to change candidate, because I don't really think that's viable at this point. And there's really just nobody else. It's a short bench. You know, anybody who's much younger might be more popular just for that reason. But the trouble with the younger folks is that they tend to be unproven, and their track records tend to be more mixed. You know, the longer a track record you have without grievous fuck-ups, the better off you are in terms of deflecting potential criticisms. But if you're younger, you don't really have that on your side. So it's much easier for people to just either point out what discrepancies there are in your record, you know, what issues you've had in your political career, or to just make shit up, just to free associate about what kinds of fuck-ups that you'll make if you're given greater responsibility. So, you know, a younger candidate would have advantages, but it would not really be enough to win the election. I think overall it would probably put the Democrats in a worse position, not a stronger position. I could be wrong, but that's just my general reading. You know, Joe Biden is there for a reason, and it's not because he's the sexy candidate people are excited about. You know, we've talked about it before. You know, he's a unity candidate. He's the kind of guy you elect, or nominate rather. He's the kind of guy you nominate when you're trying to appeal to a very large set of very diverse groups of voters. You know, it's a big anti-Trump coalition. There's a lot of different kinds of people in it. And getting a candidate that everybody is at least willing to vote for is very difficult. when your coalition is that broad. And the Democratic coalition is always broad, and it's always been difficult to get good candidates that excite people there.
Why is it so hard to find people who are exciting?
It's not. You can totally find people who are exciting. The trouble is not finding people who are exciting. Again, it's finding people who lots of different kinds of people are willing to vote for. If you look at the Democratic coalition, you've got unions, minorities, students, urban professionals, and also, I guess, union. Wait, did I say? Whatever.
Yeah, you said
so those are the main groups. And getting a candidate that appeals to all of those people is very difficult. Like blue-collar workers do not really like the same kinds of people or even really support the same kinds of policies as a lot of the sort of metrosexual urban professional class in the United States. So those are often groups that are at odds with each other and have relatively little in common. And so, one group may really like the LGBT rainbow candidate that really pushes that side, but then that kind of alienates the workers. The workers may prefer a candidate that's more rough-hewn, shall we say, and pushes workers' rights, which I think everybody kind of is on board for, but then the rough-hewn aspect alienates the urban professional crowd. So the only way to get a candidate that appeals to both, that both are willing to vote for, is to have somebody who's bland and who kind of issues very mild, moderate statements on that doesn't offend anybody, but then in turn doesn't really please anybody. That's just an inherent part of coalition building. And so, the same dynamic plays out with all of the other groups in the coalition. And it's only gotten harder because now the coalition is broader, right? They're trying to expand the coalition to encompass these, what are relatively conservative centrists that have traditionally tend to lean Republican, but that are upset by Donald Trump's antics over the course of his political career. And so conservative centrists in particular are a difficult group to square with all of the other traditional voting blocs in the Democratic coalition. So the inevitable result is an extremely moderate, bland, vanilla candidate. And there's nobody more bland and vanilla than Joe Biden. Whatever else you can say about him, you can't say he's like a big risk taker. He generally tends to play it pretty passive in terms of how he presents himself and in his style of politics. And the fact that he's old kind of plays to his advantage in that regard because he has a long career of being bland and vanilla.
I thought you were going to say a long career of being old. He's so old. Well, he's been old for a while and he's still getting older.
Well, I mean, the idea there is just that being around a long time, again, just reduces your vulnerability. Because again, if you're younger, people can just make shit up and it's easy for it to stick. But when you've been around a while, it's easier for people to kind of see your record and say, okay, well, I know this criticism isn't true because he's been around a long time and he didn't do those things. So I think that is the answer to the question. That's why the candidate for a broad coalition has to be boring. And that's why the Democrats are kind of stuck with Joe Biden right now. There's not a lot of good alternatives that can really specifically fill that niche. Hypothetically, the alternative route would be go for a really exciting younger candidate that panders to the far left, kind of like Trump panders to the far right. And then at that point, it's just a presidential race to see who can excite higher voter turnout. It's not really about appealing to the center and seeing who can win more of that vote. It's more just about, it would just be about turnout at that point. And I don't know, personally. I think probably the Republicans would win that. In general, independent centrist voters tend to lean conservative, so they would have a big advantage from that. And, if the choices are radical right, radical left, people will probably just revert to their normal preferences, or at least whatever is closest to those preferences. Mm-hmm. So that kind of election, I would assume, would lean to the right. And I think that's the assumption amongst a lot of establishment and analysts as well, which is why Joe Biden's people, advisors, they tend to kind of really push him to try to appeal as much as possible to the center. The trouble there is that a lot of people in the center are not really as politically involved, and so they tend to be a little more vulnerable to some of the ebbs and flows of political discourse, which is a really polite way of saying that they tend to be a little more vulnerable to political bullshit. And certainly we live in an era that is just fat with political bullshit. So, but Joe Biden is vulnerable in that regard because it's easy to show people and convince people that his age is a problem, much more so than with Donald Trump, even though he's not really that much younger than Joe Biden. And that's what I meant when I said at the top, when I said that Joe Biden's main mission here is to just not look old, right? The debates, the presidential debates, don't normally change a lot of minds. Most people don't even watch them historically, just because there's not really anything you can learn in a presidential debate that you're not going to learn from looking at the campaign website for a given candidate. It is basically just an infomercial for them to just pump out their talking points.
You do get to see their banter and interaction between the two of them, though, which is kind of entertaining for people, and it shows who can just verbally joust. And it was just unfortunate to see that Biden just wasn't really there. He was just kind of mumbling and incoherent and not really able to stay focused on a point and hammer it down.
Yeah, that was his problem during the debate. He had a low bar to clear. All he had to do was not make the headlines by just screwing up basic rhetoric. And, it didn't work. And so he was in the headlines. And, Donald Trump did a lot of bullshit too. He lied a lot. But, at this point, that doesn't surprise anybody. That's not even a newsworthy item.
That's part of his build.
Yeah, that for a lot of people, that's part of his appeal, right? He says things that are controversial and that a lot of people find very disagreeable. And some people think that's a merit on his part. And no analysis of why Donald Trump is popular can ignore that fact. Like, he is genuinely popular with a lot of people. Not enough people to win election. He does have to appear at least moderately sane to pick up votes in the middle to actually win. And he's kind of struggled with that over time. But, he did pretty well overall in that regard. He didn't say anything overtly stupid. There were a couple that were pretty stupid. But there were also times during the debate where he almost sounded like a normal politician. He never quite cleared the bar, but he came much closer than he usually does. So, the thing he needed to do was not look crazy. He did. Joe Biden just needed to not look and sound old, and he didn't. So just for those reasons, Joe Biden kind of lost that first debate. Mm-hmm. His people were saying that he had a cold, so that if that's true, that would have definitely had an impact.
He was really out of it, out of it. Like, you had way too much NyQuil, and you're just like, it was embarrassing.
He was looking and sounding pretty raggedy, so I could believe that he has a cold. I don't think that's outside the possibility. But regardless, he needs to do a lot better in the next one. If he did have a cold, then he needs to make sure that he's healthy for the next debate, so he can kind of come back from that first performance, because he basically just failed to do the one thing that he needed to do, which was to make it a boring, forgettable debate. Mm-hmm. But yeah, beyond that, not a lot of ramifications. Again, there's a lot of time to go until Election Day, so I don't think this is going to be the thing that kind of tips the scales. Mm-hmm. There's more drama to come, I assure you. This is just the tip of the iceberg. But it's not an auspicious beginning to sort of the more rigorous lead up to the actual election. That's going to be a rough period for Biden.
Yeah. It was hard to watch him attempt to talk.
He beat Medicare. Probably my favorite gaffe of the night. Couldn't quite find the words, and he just settled on, "We beat Medicare."
He wasn't able to talk about his execution of the evac of Afghanistan and whatnot. Like, whenever that was posed to him, he just like, and I was like, what the fuck?
Yeah, to be fair, he did get better as the night went along. He didn't end nearly as weak as he started. But, even when he was doing well, it wasn't great.
Yeah.
There were some jokers on Reddit that posted some excerpts from the Obama-Romney debate. And it's pretty remarkable just how much more coherent and lucid they were. compared to either Trump or Biden. It's remarkable how much that's changed. So yeah, I think I listened to the debate on the radio. I didn't want to watch it, but I felt I should at least listen to it. Kind of like how you might go to a NASCAR race just to see if anybody crashes, even if you're not that interested in racing. I was interested at least to see if the bare minimum would be met on the part of either candidate in the debate. So I listened to it, and in the analysis afterwards, they were taking callers, and there was one woman who joked that they politely asked foreigners outside the United States to not watch the debate because this is our personal family humiliation. That pretty well sums it up. I'm inclined to agree.
Yep, to me, he didn't seem cognitively there. It was very unfortunate. You want to have a capable leader who can respond to crises and situations as they come up. He seemed very checked out. Unfortunately, it was also a bummer. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Trump was all in. I learned a lot from him. I had no idea that everybody wanted Roe v. Wade overturned. Interesting fact. Sorry, go ahead.
Consensus issue to him, I guess. But yeah, it's not really the most promising or exciting setup to see, but we saw it, and we have to deal with the situation as it goes.
On the upside, there was a pretty funny Weird Al parody of the debate that came out recently.
Oh,
so
really?
That. Yeah.
Thank you, Weird Al, for bringing some levity to the situation. Much needed.
Yeah, he did a parody of the debate for 2020 as well. So this is basically a remake of that. It's actually called Deja Vu. Very appropriate. Well, other than the presidential debate, what else did you want to get to today?
I don't know. What else happened?
Drama. The French Parliament election is today. It's happening right now. I think it's pretty much over by now, though, because it must be pretty late. Yeah, it's the first round of voting. So there's going to be another round on July the 7th, I believe. So the results from today are not going to be the final result, but we do have early results in, at least last time I checked, and National Rally did get about 30%. That's the far-right party that a lot of people are so scared of in France. So they had a very strong showing that was the most that any party got in the election. So it seems that they are on track for maybe not a win, per se, but it's definitely a very strong showing for the first round. So we'll see how things shake out in the second round. Keep in mind, not every office that is voted on in the first round is going to be voted on in the second round. It's just those offices for which nobody won over 50% that will move on to the second round. But that's expected to be the majority of offices that are being voted on. So again, the final result is going to look pretty different. So strong showing for National Rally. That's going to have a lot of people extremely anxious. So what's going to happen in the week ahead is that there's going to be a lot of negotiating between the other parties to form some kind of coalition. And so different candidates for different offices are going to resign in order to try to pave the way for to consolidate the vote of the anti-National Rally vote into a particular set of candidates. But how that shakes out is pretty unclear right now, because Macron and his party are not very popular. But at the same time, the left-wing coalition is also relatively unpopular. And it's not clear if a kind of grand coalition between Macron's people and the far left is going to be viable. And so that could open the door for National Rally to do much better than they would otherwise. So that's going to be what I'll be watching for the next week. I'm very curious how that's going to shake out. Generally, France has been pretty good about coalescing behind anti-national rally coalitions. So I expect that the strategic voting will play out as necessary to prevent them from getting a strong presence in parliament. But we live in a wonky, unpredictable era, so I can't say that for sure. That remains to be seen. So, that's one of the big plots for the next week. Yeah, National Rally is pretty interesting. It's generally characterized as far right, but it kind of toes the line on various issues between left and right. Like in France, state intervention in the economy is much more normal. It's much closer to the center than it is in the United States. Mm-hmm. And so National Rally actually wants to do more of that. They want to lower the retirement age, more benefits, especially for families, that kind of stuff. So they kind of hewed more towards economic interventionism. But at the same time, on social issues, cultural issues, especially on immigration, they're definitely very, very right-wing. So it's kind of a reflection of the ongoing political realignment in the West, in which we're kind of moving away from a dichotomy between wings of the political spectrum that's defined by labor versus capital, and more towards a dichotomy that's defined more by the global versus the parochial. That seems to be a big part of the shift that's kind of ongoing right now. And National Rally is very much the French representation of the parochial.
Parochial is like local, more of where you're from?
Like issues very specific to where you are.
Yeah. Well, that's the divide. Urban versus rural, I guess, is another similar type of divide. Maybe not exactly the same. It's a matter of scale there, I guess.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap there. In general, rural voters tend to be more insular and more focused on the national. Not always, but, just the tendency. Mm-hmm. And then urban voters tend to be more cosmopolitan and global in outlook. Part of that is just economic. A lot of rural economies kind of are more national in scope. Again, that varies, obviously, if you're an agricultural producer in the United States, like you're a world leader in ag exports, and you're more engaged in the global economy than, say, a farmer in a lot of other places. But not everybody who lives in rural areas is a farmer, and not every farmer who lives in a rural area is engaged in international trade. Right? So in general, they tend to be more national in terms of their focus, both for economic reasons and political reasons, and also because a lot of the supports that farmers get tend to come from their government, things like food subsidies, that kind of thing. And then the economies of urban areas, and especially metropolitan areas, are inherently more global because they tend to be dominated by services sector activity. And services sector activities don't really know geographical boundaries, especially if it's something like, say, the tech sector, programming, anything to do with the web, increasingly stuff that used to be kind of more insular, but can be done remotely. A lot of that can be done online. So the services sector is increasingly something that is not rooted in geography. And yet, despite that, a lot of that tends to be in urban areas anyway, just because that's where the amenities are. And so that creates an incentive, a financial and economic incentive for voters in urban areas to lean towards more cosmopolitan, global, I guess what you would call globalist policies. Mm-hmm. But again, I would reiterate that while there's overlap there, it's not like a 100% correlation. Like I said, if you are a farmer that exports a lot of what you make, then you are dialed into the global economy. And it is quite possible to be an urbanite who is mostly focused on, for one, national identity, and two, to have your economic incentives be very much oriented towards your national economy and not towards the global economy. You can see that with something like import competing sectors. So, if you are in a business in your country that does not export but does compete with imports from abroad, obviously you're not going to be that interested in more open free trade. That only really hurts you in so much as it introduces more competition and eats into your market share. But in general, yeah, there is correlates with, there are various things that correlate with where one stands on the new spectrum of globalism versus parochialism. And among those is urban-rural. Increasingly, it's gender. A lot of men actually, a disproportionate share of men, shall we say, tend towards the parochial, and a disproportionate share of women tend towards the global. And income is another one. Age, to a degree. Brexit was disproportionately voted for by the older voting blocs in the UK, whereas younger voters disproportionately voted to stay in the EU. So that's an example. I'm sure there's a bunch of others that I'm not remembering off the top of my head here, but yeah, those are some of the main ones I'm thinking of.
Yeah, I feel like for us compared to older generations, I feel more of a global citizenship rather than necessarily like super hard going to bat for the United States. Definitely have national pride and grateful to be in this country and to have the opportunity to work and prosper and so on. So I don't hate my country, but at the same time I'm not gonna be an ass about how much I love my country. At least I try to. But yeah, younger people are probably more likely to just see general humanity and be less focused on someone's nationality in particular. It's less contingent upon their individual identity than it used to.
Yeah.
We're increasing the tribe size from the country to the planet. It's a big step. Big step for apes to make.
Yeah, and it's probably not going to succeed on the first go. My expectation is that it'll probably fail in the present, but that eventually will just end up right back where we started. And second go around, it'll probably be easier, I would expect. But yeah, it's still a pretty new idea, so I don't expect it to really go unchallenged. And it's certainly being challenged right now. So we'll probably end up with really, I think there's one of two viable paths. And when I say viable, I don't mean like viable in the optimal sense. I think these are the two paths that I think are politically viable. One is that there actually just is a rejection of globalism. And that is, the people who are anti-globalist get into power and then actually do take substantive steps to curtail it and to try to maybe not go complete autarky, as in just cutting off all trade, but significantly curbing it and trying to return to a more self-sufficient economic model for nation states. And this may or may not include moving away from supranational institutions like the European Union, the WTO, the UN, whatever. I don't know that the political side, the sovereignty side of the anti-globalist movement is as prominent as the economic side of it. I think free trade is kind of in the doghouse globally, politically speaking. And I think a lot of the support for populist kind of stems more from disruptions that were caused by free trade over the course of the past couple of decades. I think that's true even in so much as people who are anti-globalist tend to focus on social issues, because a lot of social issues, to a degree, can be traced to disruptions caused by free trade. A lot of communities, for example, that had been factory towns that then suffered severe economic downturns because they lost their factory, due either to international competition or because the factory just relocated somewhere abroad. Those places have really struggled. So, no surprise that, it tends to center there. That is to say, the economic side of anti-globalism tends to kind of emanate mostly from those places. But the political side, that tends to emanate more from traditional sources, political groups, voting blocs, what have you, that have always opposed it. You've always been able to find people, especially libertarians in the United States, who have wanted to emphasize sovereignty and the sovereignty of the state specifically in terms of foreign policy dealings. These are the guys that hate the UN and want the United States out of that. They want out of NATO. They want the United States to just be a free agent internationally and to have as much independent discretion in how it uses its power abroad as possible. So that's a pre-existing strain of thought. That's not new at all. And it's gained more prominence over time, but I feel like it was really the anti-free trade crowd that really allowed them a greater voice. I think without that, they would still be relatively marginal. Does that make sense? Am I just ranting at this point?
Overall, I believe so. It's the world opening up or closing off the different connections between countries and what people's preferences are for that level of connectedness. Because a lot of people do want that identity, that individuality, and that's a major factor for them of something they want. So going more global means you're kind of losing more of what makes you unique as a country. And you're kind of morphed into the global blob of stuff, which doesn't sound good to a lot of people.
Yeah, so that's what I was. One viable path is that they just reject it, and they try to curtail it as much as possible. But I think in the long run, that just kind of leads you back to square one, because invariably you're going to need more free trade over time. National economies can only do so much. And invariably, there's an incentive to engage in free trade because empirically, like countries that have engaged in free trade, more free trade, have done better than countries that do not. So there's also a kind of game theory element here, right? Where countries may want more autarky, but they may not be able to compete economically with other countries without engaging in free trade, especially over the long run. So, you may be able to maintain self-sufficiency for a time, but eventually competitors abroad are just going to make stuff, goods and services that are just going to be cheaper and cheaper over time compared to the stuff you're making. And that stuff is going to get smuggled in. It doesn't matter how high the barriers are. You can have 1,000% tariffs across the board if you want, but, people want cheaper stuff. And if they have to get it through smuggling, they'll do it. And eventually you'll just end up with an economy that is centered around smuggling. Trade barriers will mitigate the impact of that, but they can't really stop it. So most likely, if globalism is outright rejected, then eventually, over time, and probably through a very wrenching, violent period of history, countries will eventually return to globalism. Basically, they'll just learn the hard way. Which, is a very human way to learn. So maybe that's the more likely outcome. But the other viable path is less pessimistic. The other viable path is that globalism is rejected superficially, but in reality is just maintained and just keeps going. And that to me is the more likely path forward, because that's the path of least resistance for politicians. People want to curb free trade. They want stronger national identities. They want limitations on these. They want something to be done about what they perceive to be global problems that are unaddressed. Things like immigration, terrorism, what have you. But the reality is that governments have a relatively limited capacity to actually substantively deal with a lot of this stuff. Global problems require global solutions. No one country is going to be able to just stop the massive outflow of people from the developing world into the developed world. You would need extreme measures to do that, and it's not clear if people in liberal democracies either have the wherewithal, just in terms of willpower, to do that stuff, or are willing to breach their own constitutions and legal orders to do all of the extreme shit that you would have to do to end all that. So most likely, it's inevitable, right? And that's just one example. There's lots of global issues that you just cannot reasonably stop with just one state acting on its own, or even with relatively limited cooperation abroad. So in that sense, I think with this approach, you elect politicians like Trump. Trump is actually a pretty good example of this. He got into office. He said he was going to do all this stuff to, end free trade and apply a Muslim ban. And then he didn't actually really do any of it. He just did token measures that allowed him to pretend that he did stuff about it. He said he was going to scrap NAFTA and negotiate a whole new deal, and instead he just updated NAFTA. But then he changed the name and then pretended like it was a totally new deal. Lots of stuff like that happened during his administration. I tried to pay close attention to his free trade policy. There were a lot of questions in that field amongst economists about what he would do. And, he talked big, but he didn't really do much. It really wasn't substantive change that he brought. So globalism largely continued, even under his watch, and has continued to pace even with the global backlash against it. And, it seems to have worked, right? The measures that were taken, which didn't actually change anything, but which superficially addressed globalism and global problems, those did seem to pacify a lot of people. And I would point out that part of the reason it's successful is because a lot of the disruption and damage done, especially by China's induction into the WTO in 1999, has already been done. Like, we're pretty much through the worst of that. The most disruption happened from 2000 to about 2011. That's when people were really losing their jobs, when employment in U.S. manufacturing really dipped hard. That's the period when most of the disruption happened. But since then, there hasn't been nearly as much, right? Basically, there's an equilibrium between the Chinese and American economies that has been reached. And, there's still things that are changing. There's still competition, but the China shock is over. Like, that's done. We're pretty much at a steady state equilibrium right now. And any further dramatic changes are going to be the result of actions by one or the other country, probably in terms of industrial policy. So for that reason, there's not as many people who are still hurting from wanton free trade. Most of the people who are angry about it are angry not about current disruptions, but about disruptions that happened back in the day, back in the aughts, more so than anything that happened in the 20-teens or is happening in the 2020s. So there is a kind of delayed residual effect from that we're experiencing now. And to a degree, you can kind of blame establishment political parties and candidates for failing to recognize that shock and disruption while it was happening in the aughts, and then not doing anything about it. That kind of built up a lot of political pressure, and that's part of the reason, maybe even the main reason, why there has been a populist surge across the Western world over the past 15-some years. So they failed to do that. Now we have populists in power who are pretending to deal with the problem, but actually aren't disrupting things that much. And I'm sure corporate America would prefer no disruption, but if they have to choose fake disruption, they'll be happy with that over an actual end to free trade or a total disengagement from globalist institutions and engagement generally. Mm. So that's kind of the path we're on, and I think that's the more likely of the two viable paths I see forward that will be followed.
Mm. Sorry, sum up the two paths real quick.
Path one, actual substantive break from globalist engagement in institutions. Path two, pretend to do that, but not actually.
Brexit or posture Brexit?
Yeah, basically.
Gotcha. Okay.
I don't really think there's a path forward where you can just be like, hey, I'm super free trade and super for the status quo, and if you vote me in, I'm just going to keep doing what we've always been doing. That's not even remotely politically viable at this point. We're in a restive, angry era, and so anybody who wants to win needs to reflect that to some degree. Mm-hmm. To some degree that has to be present in a campaign platform in order for it to be a winning platform. So you can do fake change or real change. Mm-hmm. And I would point out again that if you go with change, you're probably just going to end up back where you started. Again, I don't really think there's a viable long-term alternative to free trade. That doesn't mean I don't think we could handle it better, for sure. Like, obviously, we did not handle it well in the United States during the aughts. Neither does, I would point out, too, that thinking we could do better doesn't mean I think that we will do better in future. My confidence in the establishment's ability to adjust to the times is pretty low right now. So I don't think if we had some kind of equivalent to the China shock in the aughts reoccur, I don't know that the establishment would really be any more flexible a second go around. But I certainly do think we should handle it differently. Certainly results speak for themselves, and I don't think anybody is happy with the results we've seen over the past 10 years, unless you're super gung-ho to just burn down the establishment. But that's unwise. You know, the people who want to burn down establishments are generally the ones who bear the brunt of the collapse of those establishments. History is replete with that. To put it another way, the revolution eats its children. That's an invariable part of history. You may be super excited to burn everything down right up until you get consumed by the flames, and that pretty much always happens. You know, revolutions are not the result of successful politics. They're the result of failed politics. You know, if you try to fight change too hard, then invariably inevitable change becomes violent. That's the only way it can happen. So it's much better to be wise and recognize that things change over time and allow a peaceful avenue for those changes to happen.
So one thing that is kind of a question mark is, how do we get people in to vote for who we would be excited to vote for? Like, we have the two parties, and dissatisfaction with the parties is very high, so it's not like people love the Republican or Democratic Party right now. What are the changes that we can make as voters, as citizens, to get better represented by this?
Well, do you want the cynical, superficial answer, or do you want a more optimistic, substantive
Give us
answer?
the good cop, bad cop routine.
Okay, well, I guess I'll start with the optimistic, substantive answer. So what you can do there is to just, I mean, activism is the start of it, right? I mean, assuming that we're not going to just completely re-engineer the political system, which basically is what people who ask that question actually want to do. If we assume that we're not doing that, because it's relatively unlikely, the pathway to better politics and better candidates is by way of activism, proselytizing other voters. Because, you know, the political system, whatever you can say about it, you can't say it is not representative. It is reflecting actual changes in the body politic. So, you know, if there is a character like Donald Trump who's doing well, it's not because he's lying to people or bullshitting people, although he is doing those things. The fact that he's successful is reflective of the fact that people in the body politic are themselves upset. They're angry, and they like politicians that manifest that. Even though I don't think he's telling the truth when he says he's actually going to operationalize that into substantive policy, but that's a whole other debate. You know, the fact is the system is meant to be representative, and it is producing representative candidates. There are people who want radical change. They have a Trump to vote for, and there are people who may or may not want radical change, but do not like the brand of change that Donald Trump is bringing to the table. And so they get a bland unity candidate, a kind of anti-Trump, to vote for. So if you want better candidates, you need to change your voters. You need people who are more engaged, more optimistic, who understand the issues better, and who are more willing to engage and vote for politicians that represent substantive politics rather than just showy, flashy, fake politics. And I don't want to put the blame entirely on populists on this, because, again, establishment candidates really did a lot of work, especially when I was much younger, back in the 90s and aughts. They did a lot of work to try to make any alternative to the status quo seem totally unviable. And that if you wanted to not throw away your vote, you needed to vote for an establishment right candidate or an establishment left candidate. And like I said before, all that did is bottle up pressure that grew over time and then exploded. Like, that doesn't work. So, you know, I think we need both voters who are better, but I think we also need politicians to be voted in by those more active voters that we're hypothetically talking about making here, who can vote in politicians who are more willing to take risks. Because a big reason that establishment candidates want you to think that only an established candidate can win is not just because they're, in the pockets of established interests and don't want substantive change. That's part of the equation. But it's also because it's risky to advocate for substantive change. It opens you up to criticism, especially if you actually do it and then it blows up in your face. And, a lot of experimental, radical type policymaking does end in failure, right? That can't be ignored. And if you're a politician, you don't like that. You don't want more risk. Everybody is fundamentally risk averse when you get right down to it. Obviously, it varies depending on personality, from person to person. But in general, you can generally assume people will take risk averse choices. And for politicians, risk aversion takes the form of not wanting to be bold in terms of their campaign platform. They want the focus group style politics because that gives them a kind of security blanket to think that they're covering their bases, that they're mitigating the risk of being accused of advocating for failed policies or policies that are going to be perceived as too extreme or radical. So there needs to be more risk in politics, not too much. Let's not don't be crazy about it, but we do need politicians that are not just sort of the latter-day equivalent of like a fourth-generation Ottoman emperor. The kind of guy who's born into privilege and doesn't really care that much about actually managing and expanding the state and taking care of the inheritance that he was granted. We're sort of in that stage of American history right now. We're kind of past the glory days where we were really growing fast and had a really cool, interesting project that we were developing. Now, the project's kind of getting older and it's sort of entering middle age, and the guys running it reflect that. So there needs to be some rejuvenation there. And again, while we do need politicians to do that, the way to get to that point is with the voters. Especially with primaries, one of the things that really needs to happen in the United States is for there to be a big push to get a much broader portion of the public involved in primaries. Because the outcome of any given election is mostly going to be a reflection of the people who vote in it. And if the only people voting in primaries are the crazies, then you're going to get some crazy candidates. That's just inevitable. So if you want less crazy candidates, you need to get less crazy people voting in the primaries. And yeah, I know they're not as open as like the formal actual elections. I know there's institutional resistance. Institutional actors tip the scales in primaries and in party politics much more than they do in the general. But that doesn't really matter to what I'm saying here. My point here is that in so much as that's true, then you need to fight to change that. The primaries need to be more representative of all voters and not just the ones who are the most beholden to the messages that they hear on cable television news or whatever crazy shit they're reading on the internet. People complain about how mainstream media is captured by corporations and special interests, and then they'll go and they'll get all their news from some website for which gets funding from God knows where and pushes like the craziest narratives. Like, it's not an improvement, right? Whatever problems mainstream news sources have, a lot of the countervailing sources of information, especially those that have emerged over the past 5 to 10 years, have increasingly themselves been co-opted. So I don't think there's a lot of great options there, but I think regardless, you just need to expand the voting base in the primaries, and you need to proselytize as much as possible something resembling liberal politics. And when I say liberal, I'm using the traditional classical form of liberalism. Everybody in the United States is liberal because everybody in the United States believes in free and fair elections, pluralistic politics, freedom of speech, rule of law, checks and balances. Like, this is the sine qua non of liberalism, right? That's what it's all about. Enlightenment liberalism is the foundation of the United States, and it is all but the official state ideology of the country.
Some people would just call that freedom.
Some people would just call that freedom. Some people call it slavery under the bourgeoisie or under the Jews, depending on your political preferences. You can basically think of bourgeoisie and Jews as being interchangeable. That's a kind of horseshoe theory thing. I know people don't like that. But there's a remarkable amount of overlap between those two perspectives. Regardless, the point is there needs to be more activism, there needs to be more engagement, and there needs to be more understanding of what Enlightenment liberalism is, why it works, and why it should be protected. Because right now, I think if you go around saying, hey, we need to protect liberalism in the United States, you're not going to get a positive reaction because people are not going to have any idea what you're talking about, or more problematically, they're going to think they know what you're talking about when really they're just dead wrong.
I have an idea. Having a video series that it's what are our shared values between conservatives and progressives in America. What are our shared values? The ability to vote for someone, that's a shared value. The idea that an institution does its job for the money that is sent to it, that's one of the shared values that we have. So if we can hold ourselves accountable to those shared values first and not be distracted by random crap, then our energy is much better spent than us like arguing over something like abortion that's never going to change. Like, you're not going to convince the other side, so that's not a shared value. So why would you bash your head into that wall when you could exert your energy somewhere else and get a bunch of shit done? Like, we could probably soup up our country's internet, just get a president who just gives us all fiber internet. Come on, it's not that hard to figure out. I think term limits. I think we should have an age limit on president. Sheesh.
May or may not have a substantive effect.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to pretend to have like all the answers here. You know, I'm not an expert. That's just my general idea of what some kind of positive trend would have to look like in order to convince me that it was actually happening. More realistically, the center of politics will just shift. And whatever changes are necessary to maintain the status quo will just happen organically. Because again, I don't see a lot of substantive radicalism in, say, Donald Trump or in his movement. So I see that as being a superficial change by and large.
Yeah, he's not really championing certain ideas that he's really pushing stuff through. He mainly just wants attention, is kind of my vibe and read there.
Yeah, he's trying to build a patronage network is what he's really trying to do. And American history is full of those. Like, American politics used to be very much defined by constellations of local patronage networks. You know, they kind of built on each other. FDR, for example, was successful not just because he was perceived as a working man's leader, but also because he was at the top of a pyramid that was built on top of local patronage networks across the country. You know, he was basically the top don of the biggest patronage network in the history of U.S. politics. And I don't say that as an insult. That's just how politics worked back then. You had to do it like that. There really wasn't an alternative. Like, if you wanted to get votes to support whatever it was you were pushing, or to get support in your campaign for whatever office you were running for, you pretty much had to do business with the leaders of various political machines, because that's just how the votes were distributed. You know, that's how you won. And it wasn't until probably after 1950 when that system really started to degrade substantively into more or less what we have today, which is a much more ideologically defined politics based around ideas rather than just parochial interests of local political machines. What Donald Trump, in effect, is a return to that previous mode. I don't think he can do it entirely. I don't think he could, even if he was very successful, like winning the presidency again, getting a Republican majority. I don't think he could just completely resurrect that system, but he can definitely restore it to a degree. And that's probably one of, if not my biggest gripe with Donald Trump, is that he is taking the country backwards in that sense. You know, we were supposed to be moving away from that and having politics that was more substantive and less corrupted by just, you know, petty political machine politics. And he's really very openly trying to get back to that. You know, you can kind of see that in so much as he's cowed the Republican Party as an institution. You know, various offices of the RNC have basically just become offices of the Trump family, for example. And he's already on record as just complaining that he doesn't have anyone who can be his Roy Cohn, quote unquote, you know, a famously corrupt lawyer who was in cahoots with a number of shady characters in New York City public life. So, that's one of my concerns with Trump. I know a lot of people are concerned with Trump because they think he's a fascist, but I don't think that's substantive. I don't think that's his game. I think his game is much narrower and more petty than that. I think if he could become the leader of a big patronage network, that to him would be like a major achievement. Just to be the most powerful patron in U.S. politics. Mm-hmm. That to him is more substantive as a political achievement and as a personal achievement than, say, eliminating his political enemies. Like, I don't think he actually cares about that, or certainly not about eliminating like whole classes of people that he thinks are parasites or, something like that. I don't see him as an ideologue, in other words. That doesn't mean that if he's reelected that he won't do things like that, because he has surrounded himself with people who are ideologues to varying degrees. So, that is still a concern, but that's not the main thing that I think is going to be a priority for his next administration, if he does get one.
What do you think the odds are that he changes our stance on Ukraine if Trump wins?
He says that he'll end the war very quickly. He did not stipulate how he would do that. He just said that he would. He also said that he would cut funding to Ukraine immediately, which would be difficult because funding is actually structured in a way that you kind of can't do that. But certainly he could block further support to Ukraine if he wanted to. So if we go purely by what he says, then yes, he will change radically the American position on Ukraine and American support to Ukraine. However, Donald Trump and his style of politics is famously transactional. So I don't doubt that if the Ukrainian government really wanted to, and they should, if they don't already, basically, to put it bluntly, they could buy him. He's going to have a price. So he could hypothetically cut some kind of deal with Ukraine wherein they give him something in exchange for continued support. And so long as it's substantive enough from his perspective, that could work. And Ukraine does have allies in Congress, even in the Republican Party. So there's going to be congressional institutional resistance to some of the stuff that Trump will want to do in that regard. I don't think it'll be as strong as when he was president after 2016, because a lot of the more moderate Republicans in the party have kind of marginalized themselves. They've kind of been increasingly crowded out by the Trump wing of the party. Mitch McConnell, for example, famously announced that he was going to stand down and open the way, for some new blood, because he felt he was increasingly out of touch with the party. So there won't be as much institutional resistance, but there will still be some. And depending on how many Republicans there are left in the party who still want to resist Trump's wilder impulses in that regard, it may or may not be enough to actually stop him. So between institutional resistance and between the fact that he's transactional, I think there actually is an avenue wherein America's Ukraine policy does not actually change if Donald Trump wins. Lots of caveats and asterisks there, but I don't think it's inevitable in that sense that it will change. So if we go purely by what he says, yes, it's going to change. If we actually look at how his style of politics works, maybe. Like with a lot of things with regard to Trump and a prospective second Trump administration, there's just a lot of uncertainty there. So it's almost impossible to predict accurately with any confidence.
Yep, Bitter Sugar jumped in the chat a few days ago and asked your opinion on it. In Ukraine, their government is, or at least their propaganda is telling them that the U.S. is not helping them very much at all, and that they're going to help them less if Trump wins. So we actually looked it up, and the top 3 contributors to Ukraine financially and militarily have been the U.S., Germany, and the U.K. So whether it's a lot or a little compared to Ukraine standards, the U.S. is giving the most to their effort. So
it's giving the most in terms of military aid. Aid to Ukraine does go beyond military aid, though. Mm-hmm. In terms of things like financial aid, the balance between the U.S. and the European Union is actually more even. Mm-hmm. And in terms of intangible support, the Europeans have been carrying the brunt of that load. For example, we don't have like millions of Ukrainian refugees here in the United States. Most of them are in Europe. And the burden of trying to help them, house them, educate the children, give them aid of whatever kind they need, that burden disproportionately falls on Europe. So the fact that the United States is disproportionately leading the way in terms of military aid is somewhat balanced out by that disproportionate burden in other areas. But yeah, the United States, in so much as military aid is the more important type of aid as far as the war effort, yeah, the U.S. definitely does have a leading position there. But keep in mind, too, that aid was delayed for, something like 6 months from late 23 into early 24 because of partisan bickering in Washington. And that did do some damage, and that definitely shook the faith of a lot of people in Ukraine as to just how reliable an ally the United States was going to be, especially if Trump gets reelected. So, you can't really blame them for being skeptical at this point, because even if we've given the most aid thus far, there's no guarantee that we will continue to give that aid. And even with the aid we've already given them, it generally comes with strings attached. The debate about what targets in Russia Ukraine can target with American-supplied missiles, that's a perfect example of that. Because at first we said you can't hit targets in Russia, and then we kind of prevaricated and say, well, we'll think about it, and then months later, Washington says that actually you can hit targets in Russia, but only if they meet certain conditions, and those conditions have slowly expanded over time. There is an argument to be made that that's not a dumb way to do things, just because it ensures that the escalation of American involvement in the conflict is not steep, right? It happens incrementally rather than in these big steps. So that kind of mitigates the likelihood of significant conflict between Russia and the United States. But on the other hand, the argument against it is that, we're really kind of doing a disservice to Ukraine by doing it like that, because they would definitely benefit militarily if they could just use all of the stuff we gave them to its full potential right away, rather than waiting around for all of these deliberations to happen in Washington.
So we'll see.
Yeah, if I'm Ukraine right now, if I'm in the Ukrainian government, I would strongly be pushing whatever leaders are in government that I could get to get into contact with the Trump campaign, either secretly or otherwise, to try to get a feel for what his price would be, just to get some idea of what kind of deal that they could strike to ensure that there is not a significant disruption of American military aid. They may be doing that already, but if they're not, they definitely should be. I'm going to laugh if Ukraine has to come out and produce evidence that Hunter Biden being on the board of Naftogaz was actually corruption from the Biden family. That may
Make them do a chore. Look, guys, I'll do your quest, but you have to do a quest for me first.
Well, that's what Trump wanted them to do when he was still in office, right?
Yeah, I remember that. He tried to get Zelensky to do his dirty work.
Yeah, so he may come back and say, hey, you guys wouldn't do this before. If you want me to help you, you need to do it now. And, that's not too high a price if you're the Ukrainian government for hundreds of billions of dollars worth of military assistance. So that would actually be a cheaper price that Ukraine might have to pay.
Yeah, kind of see though, but yeah.
So that wouldn't surprise me. But probably Trump will ask for something more substantive, I would guess. I'm not sure what that would be, but somebody in Kiev should definitely be thinking about that. I would point out, too, that the European Union is also engaging in hedging with regard to a potential second Trump administration. Like, they also are aware that American military aid could dry up, and so they're actually talking about significantly scaling up European military aid if Trump does get reelected. They might end up doing it anyway, but I suspect for now they're focused on whatever steps would be necessary to significantly increase production so that it would even be possible in the first place. Because right now Europe's defense industrial base is not in the best of shape. Nobody was really prepared to fight some protracted proxy war in Eastern Europe. So everybody is playing catch up in regard to that.
Well, I hope we help Ukraine people.
Well, I gave you the optimistic take for how to improve American politics, but there's also a cynical take.
Okay, what is it?
So the other one, I guess there's two ways you could do it. You could change the system substantively so that you have representative voting, right? Like a proportional voting system where seats in the legislature are appointed to parties based on whatever percentage of the vote that they win. You could do something like that. You could do ranked choice voting, or if you wanted to just be traditional and avoid completely rejigging the political system, the electoral system rather, you could just focus on forming an interest group, an NGO or whatever, getting lots of people to support it, and then predicating your what's the word I want? Endorsement, predicating your organization's endorsement on given candidates promising to do this, that, or the other thing in keeping with your mission statement. Right? That's actually how politics moves right now in the United States, for the most part. Interest groups lobby. They're not all, lobbyists are not always corporations. They're also NGOs, nonprofits, activist groups, what have you. And if they can get enough support such that they can, substantively make their endorsement mean something to a politician, politicians will listen to you. They will give you the time of day, and you can move the needle on their campaign platform. So, all of those are ways to try to make the system more representative, in so much as you don't think it's more representative right now. But the cynical take there is that all of that, if you do any of that, it's not going to substantively change things. The reason to do that stuff is not to substantively change political outcomes, but just to assuage people, to make them think that the system is becoming more representative and that their choices are better and that the candidates are better. We've talked before about how the issue with American politics is not really the electoral system per se. There are flaws with it. It could do to be updated, but if reformers got everything they wanted, I really don't think we would get substantively different outcomes. Because again, politicians and politics are where the voters are, not where the systems are. And right now, where the voters are is in a very radical, populist right-leaning mood. And so politics are shifting in that direction. So if you have a parliamentary representative voting system of some kind, you would probably get an outcome that was pretty much the same as what we would have now. But you would have a different label. You would definitely have different parties. You could vote for a party that represents your narrow specific interest rather than just one candidate who claims to represent that while also having to balance that with a bunch of other interest groups. So, people may prefer that. But again, that's just a superficial solution. If you look at Canada, they have this already. And there's, various radical parties that you can vote for. I think the NDP is the left-wing radical choice. They used to be. I don't know if they still are. Somebody from Canada in chat can correct me on that. But generally what happens is that parties like NDP get excluded from power. Like, nobody will build coalitions with them. And so the result is that they're just kind of perpetually out of power. And I think in the cases where they've been in coalitions, which is more of a recent thing, and I don't think that happened more than once, if at all. I can't quite remember. But generally, when radical groups like that do end up in coalitions, they're generally the junior partner because they're the smaller party, and their leverage is not substantive enough to actually do anything interesting. They can't really substantively pursue their campaign platform because generally they just get a couple of cabinet seats, and generally the cabinet seats they get are not really all that powerful. And if they do anything really controversial, generally, that leads to tension and pressure to roll it back. And then they have to kind of choose between breaking up the coalition and potentially ending the government, or continuing to do what they're doing and then alienating a partner and creating problems in that area. So it's not an optimal solution in the sense that it actually fixes the problems that people think that it would fix here in the United States. It's basically moving deck chairs on the Titanic. You can change the system, but the outcome is going to be the same. That's my opinion on the matter. I would point out here, and I'm sure people in chat are already saying this, I'm not an expert on everything I talk about on here. It's more painfully obvious sometimes than others. I have more of a background in economics and foreign policy. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody, so participation by chat is encouraged. I don't read chat while we do this, but I do always go through it later. and enjoy the feedback we get of whatever kind it may be.
Appreciate your take as always. It's more base than most that people are exposed to, probably.
But that's the cynical answer to your question of how to improve the politics, improve candidates, etc. Mm-hmm. One way to do it is to just superficially change things so that people think that they're better when really they're not. Really, there's no actual change happening. Kabuki theater is a big part of politics in any country.
Yeah.
To a degree, substantive politics is really substantive politics is the more desirable kind of politics, because then you're actually doing things, changing things. But the reality is that a lot of the time you don't have the votes, and even if you do, sometimes for certain problems, there's just no effective, good solutions. Sometimes there's effective solutions, but they're long-term solutions that play out over a long period of time. But, for other issues, there's just nothing at all. There's nothing you can really do, but people want you to do something, and they get really mad at you if you don't. Mm-hmm. So at that point, you have to engage in kabuki theater. You have to pretend to do something, because if you don't, you get voted out, and then somebody else just moves in, and they either just do the same thing you're doing, pretending to deal with the problem, or they do just some batshit crazy shit that either makes things worse or just reallocates the problem to some other avenue of society or politics. So again, it's just necessary and inevitable. There's just a certain proportion of politics that is always going to be bullshit, because voters themselves just don't always understand the limits of politics.
How much power should politics have over our lives? We bring on V for Vendetta. Government should be afraid of their people. Right now, we're just kind of embarrassed by our government, so we're kind of wondering what we can do. But, yeah, there are a lot of systems at play, and we are just simple primates trying our best, so there's a lot to sift through there. There are so many different reasons to go for president, and then a bunch of reasons to not. I feel like that limits the pool of people who would go for that kind of role, or just really any political role in general. Many people swear it off as I don't want to be corrupted by politics. Okay, well then who does politics for us?
Yeah, therein lie the rub.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's not really any substantive substitute for an actual movement that is organized. Because really a lot of politics is down to trust. Who do you trust to govern you and your society? And organized movements have the advantage of having the trust of the people who support them, and then also having experienced leaders who they can push into office. They can operationalize their success into office to a degree that unorganized movements or that organizations that are not part of movements cannot do. It's a nice combination of institutional prowess with genuine trust. But society in the United States anyway, has moved away from organized movements. There's so much suspicion of central authority of virtually any kind that people just inherently mistrust institutions, even if they're not government institutions, or even if they're not corporations or corporate backed. Just even large NGOs have come under a lot of scrutiny over time. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's justified, but if you get to the point where you're not willing to trust anybody, then you're just handicapping yourself. It's virtually impossible to leverage a large movement into power if there is not some kind of institutional organization that can do something with all of that support. Otherwise, it's just misdirected.
You need people to talk to the other professionals in the scene. You can't just have grassroots passion. That kind of goes back to what I discovered when I went to Occupy Dallas back in the day, was there was a lot of passion, but there was no administration to be like, okay, we're going to receive your ideas in this sense. We're going to direct your energy over to these levers. We're going to sign these petitions. We're going to do this and that. It wasn't really actionable. It was a bunch of people outpouring their dissatisfaction with the current system and the problems with it. And there are a lot of problems with it, and many of those continue to this day, but we couldn't agree on a couple of the main ones back then, so it didn't really turn into very much. If you're going to have a protest, you need to have a very clear set of demands. That was one of the cool things that things like the Hong Kong protest did well, was being connected to the professionals in the area and the people who can do that kind of legalistic crap. So you actually communicate with the existing politicians and you interface with the system. Because if you don't interface with the system, you're just a yelling person in the street, pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
We can do it.
Well put. Probably.
Yeah.
Eventually. It's a work in progress.
Chat's interested how much sway the think tanks like the Heritage Foundation have on conservative politics, and if the projects of Goal 2025 make us a Christian nationalist state.
Wait, what was the second part of the question?
And if the goals of Project 2025 would make us a national Christian state, or no, Christian nationalist.
If the goal, I mean...
What is Project 2025, to back up? What is that?
Project 2025 is a document. It's actually more of like an anthology of essays more than a document, but it's a document that was drawn up by Republican activists and people involved in the Trump campaign that outlined what they would do if Trump did get a second term in office. And it's got a lot of fringe conservative Republican type stuff in it. Mass deportations and all this kind of thing. So, it's an ideological document more than anything, and that has people very worried, because among the things they want to do is to try to pump as many conservative justices into the judicial system as possible. And so combine that with all of the other ideological shit that's in the document, and that has a lot of people on the left in particular very concerned that this is basically a document outlining the path to some kind of nationalist authoritarian Republican state, a new status quo in which there will be a permanent conservative government in the United States. A lot of that is not really justified. How do I put that? A lot of that is hysterics, basically. I mean, the document is definitely highly charged. There's a lot of stuff in there people will find disagreeable, but it's not fundamentally any different than a similar document that the Reagan administration put out before his first election. And, certainly Reagan did a lot of stuff that people didn't like, especially people on the left, but he also didn't end democracy. And I know Trump is kind of a special case. He's obviously different. But like I said earlier, I don't think he's like an authoritarian in the make. I think at worst he's an illiberal Democrat in the make. He's kind of a soft, illiberal, authoritarian type guy. And most of his interest is just in his own aggrandizement and in building some kind of patronage network, which again, I think is his main objective. But that's not going to end democracy in the United States. Again, that's just going to set it back 50 years. That's recoverable. We can do that. We can deal with that. We've done it before, right? So worst comes to worst, we can just pick up where we left off 50 years ago and rebuild what was lost, So, we will have the tools to do that if the worst does come to pass. But I don't think it will. And again, I don't think, to go back to Project 2025, I don't think the document is like an outline of like some grand master plan for taking over the government. It doesn't really fundamentally say anything that they weren't already doing, and that really every Republican administration ever has wanted to do and done when they were in office. Getting as many justices into the judicial system, like that's something that every Republican president, that's something that every president of any party has done. So that's no shock, right? Everybody knows that. Like going into any new administration, that's an objective. The idea that they're throwing red meat to their base and saying they're going to do all this stuff, about abortion and immigration, that's not surprising either. Everybody overpromises before they're elected and then invariably underdelivers once they're in office. So I don't see anything new in Project 2025 to make me think that Project 2025 itself is evidence of some kind of authoritarian trend, right? And I would point out, too, that even the document itself is not really a document. It's not a plan. It's just a bunch of different authors somewhat to varying degrees involved in the Trump administration's campaign, writing up what they would want to do in a second Trump administration. So a lot of that stuff doesn't even necessarily have Trump's backing.
It's a wish list.
It's more of a wish list, and Trump famously is not like a big reader anyway, so I doubt he even really knows much about it. It's more the people surrounding Trump that wrote it up. And in terms of free trade, for example, the chapters in the document, in the anthology, whatever you want to call it, that deal with free trade actually contradict themselves, because they actually had multiple authors talking about similar topics in different chapters, and two of the authors actually wanted different things, right? One of them wanted like a complete shutdown of free trade, and the other one was more hawkish on China, but still relatively dovish on free trade more broadly. And so, that kind of gives you an example of the lack of consistency within the document. So again, it's not a grand master plan. It's just some ideological bullshit that's thrown out to get people who like Trump excited. I wouldn't get too worried about it, right? There are things.
It is still hard to get stuff pushed through whenever you are in your term, because there is some disagreement. You have to actually get something passed. It's a lot more effort than just saying, I would like this done at some point. You have to actually do it. It's pretty hard.
Yeah. So, if everything in the document were implemented, then yes, it would probably be some kind of soft authoritarian state. But again, I don't think it's any more likely that Trump is going to deliver on any of that stuff than any other Republican administration, or for that matter, more than Trump himself did between 2016 and 2020. Like I was saying before, when Trump was in office, he didn't actually do that much to substantively change stuff. I think there's like a handful of things he did that can be considered like actual achievements. Abraham Accords. He got the big corporate tax cut passed. What else? Operation Warp Speed during the COVID pandemic. I'm sure people in chat can come up with some more, but there wasn't really that many. Challenging China, that's another one. He broke a logjam in American politics about what to do about China. So, raising tariffs at least opened the door to more substantive action there. So, there's probably a couple others, but you get the idea. Like, the stuff he did was not that dramatic, and the stuff that was substantive was not that big a departure from the norm overall. Most of the stuff that people got excited about were generally just things like executive orders or other bullshit like that. That's very easy to change when you change the president. And a lot of the craziest shit he wanted to do, Congress actually stopped him from doing. He, again, encountered a lot of institutional resistance, which kind of tied his hands a bit. Let's see. So that was the second part of the question. What was the first part of the question?
That was Project 2025. The first part was, how much sway does the Heritage Foundation have over conservative politics?
Right. So the order of causality is wrong there. It's the other way around. So it's really conservative politics that has an influence on the Heritage Foundation. There's a lot of think tanks, but there are different kinds of think tanks. And like the two main kinds that I learned when I was in grad school, because it was actually, back then I still had hope for the future and I thought that I might actually work in one. So I was learning about them, asking about them. And so there's two main kinds. One are advocacy outfits, and the other are basically what you might call analytical, is what I called them. There's probably a different technical term, but yeah, that's how I break them down. Advocacy outfits and analytical outfits. And, the analytical ones are the ones that try to do substantive research. Generally, they are somewhat influenced by their funders. And so, pretty much every think tank has certain issues they tend to focus more on, and generally has outcomes and solutions that they kind of tend to lean towards. But even in those cases, they tend to produce research and analysis that's pretty close to objectively good. There's no think tank that I would completely 100% rely on all of the time for like completely accurate analysis. But there are some that do a better job than others, and that I'm more likely to trust and more likely to go to. Center for Strategic and International Studies is pretty good. Brookings Institute is more biased, but they do pretty good research from a methodological standpoint. And there's some others, right? Council Foreign Relations is generally pretty good. On the other hand, the advocacy outfits don't even pretend to be objective, right? Their whole thing. Everybody pretends to be objective. I shouldn't say they don't pretend to be objective, but the pretense is very shallow, shall we say. with advocacy think tanks. So the Heritage Foundation is a conservative advocacy think tank, and their whole raison d'etre is to produce quote unquote research that gives evidence, quote unquote, for politicians, PR specialists, campaign managers, whatever kind of political animal you can think of. They're probably using data taken from a study produced by a biased advocacy think tank. And that, again, that's their raison d'etre. They're just designed to produce that information for consumption by political end users. And they're heavily influenced by their donors. Again, the donors give money to them specifically to do this. They want biased outcomes. They want biased research and information so that they can put forward the pretense that they're analytically and objectively reaching conclusions. They want not just to say that they support a given public policy. They want to say, we support this public policy, and here's the cost-benefit analysis that proves that this is the objectively correct, optimal thing to do. So there's lots of think tanks that specialize in producing that. And they'll jury-rig their methodology however is necessary to do that. Skewed results, purposeful omissions, just whatever they need to do. On the surface, it generally looks pretty legit. Generally, you have to really dig into the weeds and actually look at the methodology of what individual studies use to kind of see how they're skewing the way that they approach a problem to get a certain result. So in that sense, they're much more, I don't want to say dishonest, because technically the answers they get are legitimate given the research design that they use. But again, the research design itself is heavily influenced by bias. Like, they go out of their way to finagle that. Basically what you might call engineering. They engineer outcomes with their research designs.
They're given leading questions and sponsored to work on those.
Yeah, you can put it like that. Mm. So, the Heritage Foundation is not in the business of shaping public opinion per se. Rather, what they're in the business of is giving politicians what they want. And generally what politicians want is to just tell people what they want to hear, right? There are times when politicians do try to shape public opinion, but generally they're only really able to do that on stuff that the broader public doesn't care about or doesn't know much about. And in that case, it's easy. You don't really need the Heritage Foundation to manipulate people in those cases. You can just kind of make shit up and people will just assume that you're telling the truth if they trust you, right? Mm-hmm. And if they're voting for you or support your candidacy, then presumably they do trust you. So, that's shooting fish in a barrel. The harder thing to do is to try to produce objective analysis, or at least analysis that pretenses to objectivity, that you can use to try to convince people who are more centrist and more skeptical of politicians to vote for you. So if you can create a veneer of objectivity and analysis, that helps you do that. But in that case, you're not really engineering, right? You're just making an argument. Mm-hmm. And there is a certain amount of duplicity involved, but I don't think it's enough to really say that they're shaping broader public opinion, right? Especially if the people whose vote they're courting are already set in their ways in terms of a given belief, right? You can throw all the objective analysis you want, but a stubborn ideologue is not going to change their mind, right? The Heritage Foundation can't help with that either. So,
Hello? Your voice cut out. Chat, please hold while his microphone returns. He went whoop, and now nothing. This world discussion is sponsored by Queen Lilith, Spinster, Oraleus, and viewers like you. We continue with this ZVZ. Aiden Smith's mic exploded. It happens. The government got him. He's onto us. Get him. He speaks the truth. The people can't know. They can't know. Get him. Sir, I'm going for his microphone. Yeah, get him. Okay. About to spy on him. The government vanished. Yep. A lot of people don't know this, but he's been practicing ninjutsu. Well, they have a third base. What? Okay. Well, they're just attacking them. Okay. I have this many roaches. How many roaches do you have? I see some roaches. 3 roaches. A bane, a couple of queens. It's a good mix of stuff. I'll wait for +1. Maybe he needs to leave and return. I'm gonna leave and get back. Maybe he doesn't know that he DC'd. He might be monologuing this whole time. It's happened before. Nice defense. Have I gotten anything on the Steam summer sale? No, not yet anyway. Why, is there something really good I should get? I heard it's like super discount right now. Okay, he left the Discord channel. What are our shared values between conservatives and progressives? How can we work together and keep our shit together? Rage. Okay. You should get Slay the Princess and play it on stream. Why would you slay the princess? I thought you were supposed to save the princess. Hello? That's weird. Okay. We're just gonna make some stuff. Maybe he rejoined pretty soon. Maybe his internet took a poop. Happens. Or his computer crashed. Or his internet and his computer crashed. Or his internet crashed into a computer. Do I still say cheesiest motherfucker that ever lived? Yes. Like that Terran earlier who went proxy racks into mass 2-port Banshee. It was amazing. Doesn't have a single macro bone in his whole body. Alright. Y'all ready for this? Y'all ready for this? We need 8 brave warriors. Okay. It's a small claw, big claw, crab claw. Hello. Oops. Miss Scoozy. Want to kind of delay them. Oops. Surprise. I made this for you. Let's go. Get to the choppers. Okay, I'm gonna go at him. I haven't lost any yet. Okay, they do have an army there. I can respect it. Hello. I made these for you. Oh shit, the queens. Oops, ouch. It hurt me. I haven't seen him rejoin yet. Oh shit, I lost an overlord. No! I saw you had a question about the Chevron something or other. I don't know what that was about. I didn't see the Chevron thing. Assume you mean the gas company. Look at this. Secret Agent Roach is continuing to pressure. Even to this day. Even to this day, these roaches pressure. Get out of there. Get out of there. You're gonna get out of there. We need you to make it out of there. Agent Smith, no. Okay, got some more roaches. Yes. Pop, 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 pop. You'll love to see it. I'm gonna text Agent Smith just in case he's still monologuing. His computer froze. He's back in 5 to 10. What the Heritage Foundation does is mass produce the veneer of objectivity. It cannot be said that they shape conservative opinion. Cool. He summed it up and said he's going to be back in 5 to 10. That was 7 minutes ago. So he should be back any minute now. And we won the game! Hooray! Are progressive people left-leaning people? Yes, these are synonyms. But there are different elements which comprise left-leaning ideals. A person doesn't necessarily need to subscribe to all of them. For example, you could be fiscally conservative or fiscally progressive. You could be socially conservative or socially progressive, for example. Ugh, political talk. I'm out of here. See you later. See you later. Have a good rest of your night. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Neuro Subathon 5, the final day. It's positively splendid to be here with you. I'm very grateful. Very grateful. It's been a resounding success. You have my gratitude and my thanks. Tomorrow, the plan is to sleep a great deal. You might enjoy Neuro on another day. You appreciate all my time spent staying awake and pushing through. Cheers. Cheers. This could be an airport. Are we headed to Japan yet? No, too expensive. But that would be a cool place to go. Would be cool. We have weddings to go to next year. At least one wedding. Maybe 4 weddings, who knows? Who knows how many weddings, but we need to travel potentially. But also, we'll be able to get more IRL videos together. One of the main huge pluses of this subathon compared to previous ones is our ability to get IRL content together. She's a really good camera team buddy. Ugh, an SC2 stream. I'm out of here. Ew, a Zerg. Ooh. Sticky. Ooh. Get him out of here. It's okay. The people who don't like Zerg don't have to be here. People who don't like politics don't have to be here. 4 weddings and a funeral? No, hopefully not a funeral. I am not a superstitious man, but also don't put curses on me, thank you. The original progressive movement was in the late 1800s, which was better conditions for workers of the highly industrialized world. Yeah, the fight so that people aren't used as much as tools. It's a movie. Man, how many times is that used as an excuse? But it's in a movie. Valid. That's valid. I want to get more video stuff running around in different places. If you think of any places, maybe Fuzzy Cord knows some places that would be fun to see me running around in, like a video game character in LA. That was very fun. Running around Hollywood Boulevard. Let's fucking go. Let's fucking go. Running around Sydney. Pig messaged me a little bit. I told him thanks for the cast of my game. He gave me a bunch of really useful tips. He had a place I should visit. Yeah, hit me up. Yes, let me know. Let me know. His computer is starting up. Ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen. Pop, 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 pop. Someone commented on my gamer workout and said they can't imagine spin-offs to this, starring Agent Smith, where he's ordering Domino's Pizza Special to Guile's theme. Barnsdall Art Park. Let's look it up. Barnsdall Art Park. Let's see the art park. Images. Enhance. Oh, cool. Wow. Interesting. Where is this? It's got some weird shit. Hey, that's not too far from us. Hey, that's really close to us. Hey, that's outside my house! No, I'm just kidding. Fuzzy Cord's outside the window. Great place to watch the sunset. True. Pigs from Sydney? I assume that almost everyone is from Sydney, unless you're from Melbourne. And there's like someone out in Perth. But I'm ignorant of Australia. It'd be cool to go. It's a huge continent. There's so much land there. Feels like it'd be a really fun place to explore. Just watch out for huge spiders. Just watch out for those huge spiders. Okay, Agent Smith is going to be back in a few. He said almost there. Almost there. Maynard is in Adelaide? Did he move, or is that where he's always been? I think I remember him being pretty far out. What's wrong with Perth? Is it like really weird? New Zealand is better because it's the Shire. The Shire. It's completely alone. Yeah, they're on the other side of the world. Spiders, dingoes, snakes. All manner of creatures. Alright, give me a quick restroom break and we'll be right back with world discussion with Agent Smith. We might pivot into a bit of Baldur's Gate after. I don't know if we're getting to a stopping point or we just talk about the world the whole time. I'm chilling. I appreciate you very much. It is 8 p.m. on the final day and I'm filled with gratitude and joy. Thank you. Thank you. It's 50% airport. So almost no one lives there? Oh. 5 hours from Perth to Brisbane. Brisbane or Brisbane? BRB chat, love you. Yeah, I think I've seen or heard Maynard and Pig and a few other people say Melbourne and Brisbane a few times. Americans usually like Australian accents. They think they're cool. Australians, do you think your accent is cool? Why or why not? Can install COD, you're from South Africa, yeah. Vibe live down there, yeah. Goes alright, yeah? It's good. It's got like a relaxed swagger to it. American can seem too clean and try hard. Australian seems more, I don't give a fuck. Is how it sounds anyway. Do you have a South African accent? Can install COD? Chad, how would you describe your accent? You get misidentified? As what? This is an apple. Who here likes apples? Where did I put my phone? The fuck? Hello?
Anybody there?
He's back. Welcome back.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. Your computer shit itself. It happens. It's happened to me before.
Been doing that for years, but had not happened while we were doing this up until the time it happened 2 weeks ago, and then this time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a new
PC upgrade time.
It is 10 years old, actually older than that.
Mm-hmm. Dude, I'm so proud of Kukio. He made a monster that could handle Baldur's Gate in the future, pretty much. That's insane. That's insane, dude.
He did good work. And I asked him to make it so that I could upgrade it so it would last a long time. So
yeah, still using it.
Good on him. Good design. Just wish I could figure out why it crashes like that. It doesn't blue screen. It just, all of the accessories lose power and the monitor freezes. It's a very specific kind of crash. And I don't really understand it.
Yeah. Well, welcome back. Let's hope that it holds. I've crashed during Agent Smith discussion before, so it's not a big deal. Even good computers trying their best will crash. We don't always know why. I'm very much George of the Jungle when it comes to computers. I can push button good, but I don't know how it works.
Well, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for that to take 20 minutes. My computer's very slow, and Discord was uncooperative.
That's okay. Do you want to dig into more world discussion or hit some Baldur's Gate?
We should at least get to the Chevron deference thing.
Okay.
Because that was the actual big news item from the past week. Everything else has been more superficial stuff.
Cool. Let me get my water refilled and then I'll come back and we'll talk about that. You can start, actually. Go ahead.
Are you familiar with the Chevron deference? Oh, you already... Okay. You already went to get the water. Well, Chevron deference is a precedent, or it had been a precedent, wherein the courts would defer to the authority of federal agencies in terms of federal rules. I think we've talked before on here about administrative states. Administrative agencies. Administrative agencies are the entities that are actually responsible for operationalizing legislation into action. So if you pass a law saying we want to regulate such and such industry and we don't want them to do this or that, the legislation in question may or may not stipulate exactly how the government is going to actually accomplish those goals. And historically, federal agencies have had broad discretion in interpreting those kinds of legislation so that they could operationalize them by developing rules by which the objectives of the legislation could be achieved. And sometimes they went too far, sometimes they didn't go far enough, right, whatever. But there was a big court case back in, I want to say the 50s, maybe? I can't quite remember exactly it was, but it involved Chevron. And the court ruled that agencies do have broad discretion in drawing up rules to actually enforce regulations. And so Chevron deference is basically a reference to that ruling wherein courts will assume that federal agencies know what they're doing and are accurately and objectively enforcing the law when they draw up administrative rules in order to enforce the law as written by Congress. Now, corporations especially, but in general, the business community, more broadly, have been very skeptical about Chevron deference because from their perspective, a lot of the stuff that administrative agencies do not actually reflect necessarily the actual objectives written into legislation. For them, it represents a kind of overreach that is often abused in order to achieve maybe some kind of political objective, or maybe, if not a political objective, then some kind of objective that is peripheral, or maybe just totally unrelated to the core legislation that the rulemaking is supposed to be implemented to enforce. And so the business community has been very skeptical of that, and they've tried repeatedly over time to challenge administrative rules that they feel are overreach, but generally they've always failed because of Chevron deference. So the Supreme Court ruled over the past week, in a ruling that occurred within the past week, that the Chevron deference is overruled. So no longer will courts automatically assume that agencies are in the right when they're defending agency rules that are being challenged in court.
These are government agencies specifically?
Federal agencies specifically.
Okay.
So that precedent is gone, and so from now on, federal agencies cannot assume that any given rule that they write up will be looked on favorably by the courts. It was never the case that courts could never strike down administrative agency rules before. It was just that the scales were heavily skewed in favor of the federal government. There had to be a really, really good reason to overturn an agency rule for a challenger to actually see it struck down in court. But because of this recent Supreme Court ruling, the scales are now much more evenly balanced. Basically, the business community will find it much easier to challenge the administrative state in its rulemaking. And the impact of that is going to be varied. It's not going to be the case that administrative agencies are just going to stop issuing rules that are not directly traceable to specific provisions within legislation. That's just not practical. So, that's going to continue. But what will happen is that the elimination of the Chevron deference is going to have a chilling effect on administrative agencies, such that the scope of their rulemaking is going to be much more narrow and much less ambitious. They're going to want much more strict readings of legislation before they implement broad-ranging rules. Congress, for its part, will be affected as well, because obviously the ruling is basically a direct challenge, if not an order, to Congress to write legislation with more deliberation and more specificity. The Supreme Court does not want Congress just to write laws that say, we want a thing not to happen, and we're going to let the executive branch do whatever is necessary to ensure it doesn't happen. That's just too broad. The Supreme Court is saying that in order for executive authority to be exercised constitutionally, they need to exercise it in accordance with very specific, or at least relatively specific provisions within legislation passed by Congress. So Congress should, hypothetically, in future, write more detailed, specific legislation. Administrative agencies will be chilled in terms of their rulemaking. Also, it's been noted that the court has, in effect, seized power from the other two agencies, since going forward, any given agency rule that is challenged, and pretty much all of them can be challenged now, will have to pass muster with the court, as opposed to just purely the agency experts that had written up the legislation. So the criticism is that agency rulemaking before, when the Chevron deference was still in effect, was largely defined by quote-unquote experts. That's kind of a charitable assessment. It wasn't always experts. Lobbyists had a big role in that too. So it's not entirely a bad thing here that the Chevron deference is gone and that rulemaking is somewhat proscribed here. But in so much as there were objective expert opinions that were forming the basis of the agency rules, that's less likely to be the case now. And that will be, and that, in so much as that's a bad thing, that'll definitely be a problem going forward. But the criticism is that those experts now will be less relevant to rulemaking than the opinions, expert or not expert, of judges. And the criticism is that judges will be much poorer, judges, of whether or not a rule is objective or not, or is best in keeping with the objectives of given legislation. Basically, judges will be easier to manipulate into thinking that a given rule is unnecessary when actually it is. So the Supreme Court has enhanced the power of the judiciary in that sense. Whether or not that actually makes a difference in the long run, we'll see. One of the big questions going forward is the degree to which established agency rules can be challenged in court. I think one of the justices that ruled that was part of the majority in the ruling, said that those cases in which agency rules were challenged in the past and were upheld, those cannot be challenged again. So those are established case law. But he did say that those that were not challenged could now be challenged. Something to that effect. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not the best guy to ask about this stuff. But like I said, this is easily the one item that happened in the news over the past week that was the most substantive. The Supreme Court has been issuing rulings for the past couple weeks, and this is not the only one, but this is probably the one that's going to have the most dramatic, tangible effect on the exercise of the law in the United States.
This increases the power of the courts as well?
In so much as it means that the court will have a de facto veto over agency rulemaking, then yes. Before, they could technically strike down agency rules, but because of the Chevron deference, they were supposed to assume that agency rules were legitimate and that they should not be struck down unless there was a very good reason. In other words, the bar that a challenger to an agency rule had to clear was very high before, and that limited the court's ability to challenge established agency rules. But now that bar has been much lowered to the point where it's going to be much easier for things like judicial bias, like a judge's individual bias, to affect the outcome of a given ruling. And that in turn means that the ability of judges to proscribe agency rules, if they want to, for whatever reason, is much higher and much easier than it used to be. So if you trust that judges in the United States are objective and are always doing their best, you could argue that this is a lateral move and that it's not going to have a big impact on rulings. But pretty much nobody has that much faith in the judicial system at this point. I think there is more hysterics than objectivity in some of the more extreme proclamations about how this is going to just destroy the administrative state's ability to administer, law in the United States. Certainly, I don't blame people for being skeptical and for seeing this as a step backwards for the ability of the state to regulate. Can you still hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Oh, okay. Discord froze up for a minute.
Sounds good here.
Awesome. So yeah, Chevron deference. Incidentally, as a side note here, the Supreme Court case in question, from whence this ruling came, actually involved a fishing company, I believe. Basically, there was an administrative agency that, I think it was the EPA, was trying to enforce some laws that required conservation of fishing stock. So they were trying to prevent overfishing, and as a part of that remit, what I think was the EPA, somebody please correct me if I'm wrong. You know, EPA doesn't sound like the right agency now that I think about it, but whatever it was, the way they chose to interpret that law was to require fishing boats to hire government contractors to observe their fishing operations to ensure that they were not fishing beyond federal quotas. And the fishing companies in question said that it was not constitutional for the federal government to require them to hire basically federal observers to ensure that they were observing the law. And the Supreme Court, in effect, not only agreed with them, but also just decided, hey, fuck it, let's just get rid of the Chevron deference while we're at it. So a big sea change there in terms of the law.
Interesting. The court's making big moves.
Let's see. So Chevron was a big one. Let me see. I've got my notes back up now. So let me see if I hit all the right notes. Yeah, 1976 fishing regulation to limit overfishing. Yada, yada, yada. Yeah, I think I pretty much hit it. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not even going to pretend like that was like a really great explanation, but that's the best I can do. It's important to note, in so much as we are covering current events, but yeah, beyond that, that's pretty much the extent of the depth I can get into there. Oh, I did have details here. So the cost to commercial fishermen of paying for the monitoring, that is to say the federal contractors, was estimated at $710 per day for 19 days a year. And according to the article I read, that could reduce a vessel's income by up to 20%. That's apparently citing government figures there. So, you know, not really cheap. You can't blame them for being upset. I would point out, too, that the program was not exclusively funding this operation with funds from the fishing industry. It was designed to rather split costs between the federal government and the industry. So the government did cover some of those costs. They were just asking the fishing industry to help with those costs. And there was another one with the SEC, but we could save that for later. That wasn't too big a deal. I think other than that, the only thing I wanted to get to was the coup in Bolivia. Did you see that?
I think I heard about that, but I didn't look into it. What happened? Well, there's a coup.
There was a coup attempt. Yeah, there was a coup attempt. There was a general named Juan Jose Zuniga. And he was stripped of his military command. I haven't gotten the details as to exactly why, but he responded to that a couple days later by ordering his troops to go to the presidential palace with him, whereupon they broke through the front gate and then demanded that the president resign. And the president responded by walking out to meet the general in amongst his troops and telling him that he was staining the uniform, that he wasn't going to step down, and that he needed to leave the premises. And yeah, that pretty much worked. That was the end of the coup.
Damn.
Yeah, so it wasn't much of a coup. if you do want to overthrow a government, you kind of do need to do some homework, right? You got to kind of establish contact with major institutional players, get them on side, have a plan of action. It's not really the kind of thing you can just do because you're butthurt and want to throw a hissy fit, right? You can't really plan it over the course of like 48 hours. So this was like dime store coup plotting here. Definitely F tier coup plotting.
The dude, where's my car coup? Dude, what should we do with our coup? I don't know, man. Ask Kyle. He was in a revolution. Hey, Kyle, what were you in? Oh, you don't want to know. It didn't go well. Bolivia's coup.
So there was a bit of drama about that. Yeah, I did have somebody asked last time, is the Zimbabwe gold currency, the Zimbabwe gold as it's called, redeemable for gold? And I didn't know the answer to that, so I looked it up, and it is not redeemable for gold. It's only backed by a basket of assets that includes gold. So it is not technically a fully gold-backed currency. It's more like a partially gold-backed currency. Also, now that I'm thinking about it, a couple weeks ago, somebody asked about a story they read saying that an agreement that the United States had with the Saudis, by which the United States would assist with Saudi security in exchange for the Saudis using petrodollars to help maintain the US dollar as the globe's main reserve currency, was ending, and that the dollar could be in trouble because of it. And I said at the time that I wasn't aware of the pact and that I didn't think it would matter regardless, and I've since looked into that, and it turns out it was just like a totally fake news story. It wasn't real. So my instincts were right. There is not, in fact, any such agreement in place between the US and the Saudis, and there never has been, it seems.
I see.
Oh, and we did have we asked last time, we asked chat when the United Kingdom ended conscription, because I'd said that I knew that they had it during World War II, and that I thought they'd had it for a few years after, but I wasn't sure exactly when they'd ended it. So somebody in chat, Clyman High, said that the United Kingdom had conscription. What he said specifically, I'll just quote from his comment. It existed for two periods of modern times. The first was 1916 to 1920, and the second was 39 to 1960. So the last conscription term ended in 1963.
Gotcha. So it's been a while.
It's been a hot minute. Yeah, they've had a long tradition of volunteer armed forces. They only go for conscription when shit hits the fan.
Yeah.
There was a lot of drama in the United States when the U.S. moved off of the conscription model to an all-volunteer force. We'd more or less continuously done conscription from the end of World War II onwards. I think there were a couple years when we didn't do it, like maybe in the late 40s, but yeah, Korea brought it back, and then we had Vietnam not too long after. So, we did a lot of drafting after World War II until the mid-70s when we switched over to an all-volunteer model. And there was actually a lot of concern in NATO that, because the fear was that the United States military could not maintain large enough standing force if it was just all volunteer. The thinking was that if the United States was to field a large enough military to contest a potential conflict with the Soviet Union, that we would need, invariably, large numbers of conscripts. So the British in particular were pretty skeptical about that, but in the end, nothing happened. It worked out fine. The Cold War ended without incident, so in the end, it was much ado about nothing, but there was some consternation to that point. And I would point out, too, that some of the deliberations in Congress about whether or not to allow the shift to an all-volunteer force also involved Milton Friedman, weirdly enough. And he actually made the case in front of a congressional hearing that conscription was basically slavery, and that it was ethically wrong. And that, of course, raised the ire of some military officers that were at the hearing, who made the case that, conscripts made fine soldiers, that it was an honorable thing, and that we should not eschew conscripts. And of course, Milton Friedman made the case that, yeah, it's still slavery, bro. Some back and forth there. It was an interesting debate, so to speak, about the ethical merits of conscription, which you don't really see much of in modern politics. It was damn sure not something you saw in the presidential debate. But I thought it might be worth mentioning there. You can probably find it on YouTube. But yeah, that's pretty much all I had.
Nice.
There was an Israeli Supreme Court ruling. There was the Geneva Conference where everybody pretended to try to work towards a peace agreement with Ukraine. Really, it was just about basically fundraising. That's in effect what it turned into. I don't think I had any of the big items that I could really get to.
Oh, cool. Well, thanks for breaking that down. I'm stuck on a Zerg versus Protoss, so if you had any funny or other stuff before we shift gears, I'd be down for that.
I hope that 20-minute break did not put chat off too much.
No. We're at the last bit of a subathon, so it's been kind of an epic and contemplative day, because I've been live now for 30 continuous days.
Gotcha.
And then we were also playing Alien Isolation earlier, which is its own kind of experience.
I guess they couldn't be any more put off than they were before.
Yeah,
they always
exactly.
get upset when I was talking. They always get upset when I talk about it. Invariably.
Not all of them get upset. I feel like there are usually a couple people who are 2 buzzwords away from going on a rant. So whenever politics are brought up, that's going to activate certain people, but some people will really like your takes, so appreciate you coming on as usual.
Fair enough. I try.
Yeah.
Please give feedback if you don't like it. Again, I like to learn. You can call me a communist if you want, but tell me why. Tell me what I can do better. I appreciate the feedback. Well, let's see. I did have some weird news. I guess I could get to some of that. I've been sitting on some of it for a while. Did I tell you about the Korean balloons?
No.
Yeah, so, South Korean activists, sometimes in conjunction with the government, will tie shit to balloons and float them over DMs. So they did that, I think a month or so ago. And, it's the usual stuff. There's like USB sticks that have K-pop and music videos on them. Sometimes they'll put in anti-North Korea leaflets, the usual stuff. Nothing really all that surprising. So North Korea actually retaliated to the most recent balloon floating by floating some balloons of their own into South Korea. And in their case, attached to their balloons was a combination of trash, some of which contained fecal matter, toilet paper, dark soil, quote unquote, basically human excrement, batteries, and then some other random shit.
Wow.
So some passive-aggressive ballooning happening across the DMZ.
So Korea is one of the best StarCraft countries in the world. To us, that sounds like floating buildings over each other's bases just to showboat and be annoying. Not actually dealing damage and hurting anyone, but being annoying and having a presence there. And letting the opponent know that you're unhappy with them.
Certainly Pyongyang is perpetually unhappy.
Yes. They're the Hermit Kingdom. Hermits are supposed to be grouchy and...
Leave me alone. You're all corrupt. We're the best here. We go back in my shell.
Oh yes, great leader who hits a hole-in-one in golf every time.
What a narrative. What a drama. When will the people revolt and the government collapse? 5 years or 50 years or something in between? Korea said they're potentially sending some engineering troops to Ukraine in support of Russia.
Yeah. That's right.
Is that North Korean?
I forgot to put that in my note. Yeah, North Korea announced that they were going to send some troops to help Russia in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And so that got people excited because they were saying, what are they formally joining the war? Is there going to be like a horde of North Koreans in Ukraine?
Mm-hmm.
The answer is no. It's going to be an engineering battalion, as I recall. So they're going to send some combat engineers to help build fortifications, dig ditches, that kind of stuff. They're probably not going to be involved in any combat.
So it's not like the TF2 guy who sets up the turret?
No, I'm afraid not. Technology has not yet reached the lofty heights of Team Fortress 2.
Damn, engineering troops, that's immediately what I thought it was going to be. Or they just hit the turret with the wrench and it gets stronger.
No. Fewer turrets, more ditches and tunnels and whatnot.
Okay.
Trenches, that's the word I wanted.
Trenches, gotcha.
I think we actually did have some questions. Let me try to take a look at that. Given that Mexico is named for the Mexica people pronounced Mexica, is it? And Nahuatl, should Texas be pronounced Texas? I don't know about Mexica and Texas, but I do know that the original name of Texas was Tejas, which is the native word for friendship.
Yep.
Don't ask me what native group. I have no idea. I absolutely not remember. I just remembered friendship is the state motto, I think. And Tejas was like the original native word for that, which is why the Spanish called it Tejas. But because they were Basque Spanish, they did not spell it with a J. They were in the Basque language, the letter for the H sound is actually the letter X. So they spelled it Texas. And so Anglo speakers like us misread that as Texas instead of Tejas. It became Texas forever after.
That's funny. Because of a language mistake.
Yeah, lots of that throughout history.
Interesting.
People would get upset if it happened now, but back in the day it was just the norm and nobody gave a shit. I think it's interesting. I think little stories like that say a lot about how countries and cultures. It's fun history, in my opinion. But yeah, I don't know about the Mexica thing. That's new to me. I always thought it was pronounced Mexico, or Mexico, more like. I'd never heard Mexica before. But it's Fuzzy Cord, so I would defer to him. He's smart. Fuzzy Cord is smarter than me, from what I've read in chat. So I'm inclined to trust him on that.
There are many kinds of smartness, though.
Let's see. I recently heard an interview with Yuval Levine. He said that the U.S. political system was designed to get very little done unless there is a majority, which is both lasting, very small, or short-lived majority won't suffice. Oh, there's more here. Additionally, he described a divide in opinion on the function of government. Some people think the purpose of government is to get things done. Therefore, things like the filibuster are bad. Others think the purpose of government is to force collaboration, targeting between groups who disagree. Therefore, filibuster are vitally important. I thought it was an interesting way of framing things. Any thoughts? Yeah, that's a much smarter analysis than I'm capable of. So yeah, I agree is my short answer. My long answer, yeah, from the very start, there's been a divide in the Anglosphere between those who wanted a more traditional top-down hierarchical, dare I say, authoritarian government, and those who wanted something resembling something that resembled more the Enlightenment liberalism notions of small government that got out of people's way. So, that was at the very core of the American Revolution. Liberally inclined upheaval versus the 1700s.
Your mic is cutting out slightly with the activation threshold. I'm not sure.
Oh, sorry. My mic is misbehaving now. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So I was just saying that. Could you hear what I said?
Most of it, yes.
Most of it, okay. Good enough. Basically, liberalism was a major issue in Europe in the late 1700s, 1800s. And so that bled into the political discord within British politics. And people in Britain itself tended to be more conservative, not least because it was, dominated by major landowners. And they preferred a system that was more hierarchical and top-down. And people, that is to say, British people in the Americas, in what would become the United States, didn't like that. They wanted a different mode. They were more influenced by Enlightenment liberalism, and they lobbied and eventually fought to get a system that enshrined and institutionalized those ideals. So I guess this is a long-winded way of saying that the difference between American liberalism and, basically European liberalism, more specifically British liberalism, is path dependent, right? It's the result of historical factors. People in the United States kind of evolved politically during the colonial period without state over. They wanted that basically for all time. And the early design of institutions reflects that preference. Whereas in Britain, the political culture and political institutions evolved over time to reflect basically the status quo. They did not deviate nearly as much from what came before. Obviously British politics became more representative over time, but they never really fully abandoned the idea that the state was paramount and that the state should have full power to intervene in people's lives and economy, just everything. And that in the 19th century, if not also the 1700s, reflected the divide between monarchists and liberals, but later on it came to more reflect the divide between socialists and laissez-faire conservatives. So there was kind of some role changes there over time, but the basic divide remained in place. And obviously socialists were not monarch, but they had their own reason for preferring statist solutions to various public problems. In the United States, our socialists never really got nearly as prominent. Whether or not that's because of political institutions being designed the way they are is kind of a chicken and egg argument. Certainly that was influential, but there were also a variety of cultural factors, historical factors, path-dependent type stuff that also influenced that. So yes, I agree fully with the characterization of this divide in opinion being defined by, a definition of politics as being inherently obstructionist, as that it should be inherently obstructionist, and then an opposing field of thought that says that it should be inherently obstructionist. But what I'm saying here is that that argument has pretty much largely been answered by historical path-dependent factors. So it can change a little bit going forward. There's always room for change, especially in a representative system, but the historical and cultural factors kind of baked in some of those preferences, probably for the long term, if not permanently. So there's room for debate, but I doubt you're going to be able to change things too much. Because there's another chicken and egg argument, too, about the degree to which the evolution of systems, political systems, has shaped political culture, as opposed to the degree to which political culture has shaped political systems. So obviously the political culture in 1700, laissez-faire, very Enlightenment liberal, and they designed institutions that upheld that reflected that. But then you can turn around and argue that over the subsequent 200 years that the liberal nature of those systems propagated the liberal political culture that shaped them. So to what degree one or the other propagates the other and which is the more important in doing so, that's kind of an ongoing debate, and I'm definitely not smart enough to convince anybody one way or the other. But I do think it's a very difficult argument to prove one way or the other, too. So I don't think this debate is going to be decided anytime soon. I don't think there's any decisive answer there. That's kind of a rambling answer. I don't know how satisfactory that is, but hopefully somebody finds it mildly interesting.
A mild level of interest was had by all.
That's always been my objective, to be mildly entertaining.
Mm-hmm.
That's the tagline of the club my friends and I formed in college. History Science Theater 3000. Join HST3K and be mildly entertaining.
It's a modest goal for a modest aim. Parts you could hear made sense. Yeah, some of it was chopping out. I'm not sure if it's a Discord problem or an internet problem.
I don't know. Maybe I need to exit out of Chrome because I have way too many tabs open right now.
Try that as a step. Are you one of those 50 plus tab people still?
I'm one of those 20K tab type people.
What?
Yeah, I have an app on my installed in my Chrome browser that lets me save tabs that I don't read. And sometimes a lot of the time I'll just queue up stuff that I think is interesting reading, but then I'll just stow it for later. And sometimes later never comes, and they just kind of accumulate over time. So I think I'm up to 20K right now.
20K tabs. Man, I thought having 20 tabs was a lot. All right, now in Chrome I have 4. A Twitch thing that I can edit stuff. Then I have 2 Google Documents, and then I have Barnsdall Art Park on Google Maps. But that's all I have. My stream performance goes way down if I have a whole bunch of tabs open, so I have to be careful.
Those are rookie numbers, Neuro. You got to get those numbers up.
Yeah, I bet your computer goes super fast when you close Chrome.
It's helpful. It's certainly helpful.
Yep. Master of tabs. We found one of your superpowers. He's keeping tabs on the world. One for each country, at least.
I wish.
That's pretty
Nothing's so
badass.
expensive.
That's like global mastermind shit. Okay, do you want to jump around in Faerun a bit?
Yeah, that sounds like fun.
Okay. We will have some chilling in Baldur's Gate time with Agent Smith here. Maybe not for super long. Actually, Subathon has 2 minutes on. We'll see. We may just wrap up here soon. The hard cap tonight, we'll just call it midnight. Trisha said she was fine with that. I've been streaming for 30 days now. So it's been a very victorious run. Great news. I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but the Dota team that I've been coaching on the side, I just had a meeting with them talking about performance prep, and they actually qualified to go to an event in Peru, and they're going to fly out there. So that was really big thing for the team. There's a lot of stuff that the Dota Pro community is not doing in terms of traditional sports discipline and refinement and stuff. And I actually made a class that I did first to kind of prep for the session with them, where I talked about performance prep and the different physical and mental checks that you want to do before you get into like trying to perform at your maximum level. And the rough list is 9 things, just real quick running down them. It's sleep and the quality of the sleep you got, your hydration level, your breathing. If you're having deep and full breathing, that sets a calm and prepared tone. Your diet, the better your body is at getting the energy it needs, but not too much, the cleaner it's going to run. Your posture has a lot of bearing on your confidence and just your ability to execute things quickly. And then your hygiene, feeling clean and stuff gives you a lot of advantages. People tend to judge you better if you're clean and well groomed, and then you tend to feel more prepared and more together with hygiene. To the hard cap, we got another 10. Nice. We were at 1 minute there. Saved. Environment is another factor for your performance. What's around you, how noisy your environment is, how messy it is. That's another factor. Decompression. So having something that you can do to mentally relax for a little bit and not be fussing about the woes of the world and the work that you have to do, but actually have some relaxing time. This could mean different things to different people. It could be shows. It could be quality time with a partner. It could be taking your dog for a walk. It could be browsing lewd things on the internet, like whatever you need to do to kind of decompress. And then waking up, which is rousing your body and getting into the combat mode. Because these Dota gamers and StarCraft gamers are inherently sitting in chairs doing their job, it doesn't appear inherently physical in nature, but if you roll out of bed and then try to perform, it's not going to be good. You do need to warm up your body as though you're about to go into a boxing match against someone, and I was very clear that they need the level of physical seriousness that a physical athlete needs, because games like Dota 2 require so much brain power and so much mechanical quickness of hand that you can't underestimate the physical factors at all. And it was really refreshing to see that these people who are the pros, they started to score themselves, and they all posted their scores in the Discord, and were like, I just scored a 3 out of 10 for today, or 3 out of 9. And then one person was 0 out of 9, another person was 4, I think. So having all these things checked makes you feel powerful. If you have all of these things done, you're slept, all your basic physical needs are met, you're also holding your body in a strong and confident position, then that just causes you to feel better about making big plays and trusting yourself. It's not going to guarantee that you're going to be a gaming champion or a champion at whatever your craft is by following these, but you're increasing your chances of good performance and you're lowering your chances of a bad performance by checking as many of these boxes as you can. One of the things that I could do better is hygiene. Trisha has helped me with my grooming a good deal. I'm kind of like Georgia the Jungle in the sense that I really get behind physical fitness and working out, and I'm naturally motivated to do that, but I'm not as motivated to like try to smell nice all the time. Like, to me, man smell, who cares, whatever. But being fresh does make you feel better about yourself. You feel less gross. Other people like being around you more, stuff like that. So yeah, hygiene I could do better at. She's been brushing my hair as well, which is normally really tangly. I've got like bird's nests and shit in there. Yeah. And then posture is one that is like a constant battle against your own laziness. I noticed today when I was playing Alien Isolation, I slooped fully back in my chair and was being like full lazy. So I am a little bit tired. But yeah, think about this list for yourself, chat. This was probably the biggest actionable deliverable of the subathon, where it's something that's a direct point of value that people can use as criteria to just do a check before you get into stuff. And then I didn't really get into the mental stuff as much with them, but before you perform, it's really important to know how you're running before you get into something. Am I nervous? Do I feel prepared? Am I angry? And just kind of knowing where you're at is a super huge step to gauging your performance, and also setting your expectations accordingly. So yeah, performance prep, and it helped Dota players.
Sound advice. Well, I'm glad the people you helped out are doing so well.
Yeah, me too.
Best of luck to them.
Hell yeah. So the timer went up to 2 hours now, so we have time for some Baldur's Gate. Wow. It was just about to end. It's ready to wrap up.